Hello, beautiful humans. Welcome to the Midlife Revolution. I'm your host, Megan Connor. For those of you who are new to the channel, let me give you a little bit of background. Lori Vallow is my first cousin. We spent summers together as children. I lived with her and my cousin Adam in Austin for a few months during one summer. She was a bridesmaid at my wedding, and her oldest son, Colby, is just a little bit younger than my oldest daughter. When the two of them were growing up together, they were pretty close. Lori and I would take them to the photo studio at Target and they would get pictures taken together. Colby and my oldest daughter spent a lot of time in their early adolescence in the outdoors and going on hikes. Because Janice and Barry, who are Lori's parents, lived in San Antonio, we actually spent a lot of time with their family while they lived here. Lori later moved to Austin, where I would travel to get my hair cut pretty often, and I went to visit her in the home that she shared with Joe Ryan when Tylee was a baby. The last time that I saw Tylee, she was probably only about 3 years old. I lost touch with Lori shortly after that, when she started going through her divorce with Joe Ryan. It was a time in my life where I was going through a lot of struggles as well. I had 4 children at the time, and I was just getting ready to start graduate school. I did meet Charles one time when he was getting baptized into the church. And unfortunately, I never did meet JJ. I did keep in close touch with Summer over social media, so I saw a lot of the family pictures, and Summer and I were friendly up until just a few years ago. In July of 2019, when Charles was killed, I was still on relatively good terms with the Coxes and with Summer, but I haven't heard from her since then personally. And due to some other family struggles, I haven't spoken to Janice and Barry in years. But because I grew up with Lori and we spent a lot of time together, we had a lot of interactions in our young mom lives. I do have a lot of insights about the way that she communicates and interacts with other people in her life. I personally experienced some of her narcissistic tendencies when I was living with her in the apartment in Austin. She and I never did talk about or resolve any of our disagreements because that's just kind of how the family has always worked. If there's an unpleasant interaction, we just pretend like it didn't happen and we just see you at the next family event. I was also the only other family member who was present with Alex when we together found Stacy unresponsive in Janice and Barry's home. It was certainly a traumatic experience at the time, but I never dreamed that any kind of foul play was involved until the children were reported missing, and I started to review the circumstances of that experience compared with what I knew Alex's behavior was like since that time. A lot of this information I shared on 2 interviews that I did, one with Hidden True Crime with Lauren Matthias and the other on Mormon Stories with John DeLynn. Those episodes are available in the show notes if you haven't seen them yet and you're curious about some of the Cox family dynamics intertwined with my own story in exiting the Mormon Church. Most people who follow the Lori Vallow case know by now that last week on October 6th, Colby released an interview that he did with his mother while she is awaiting trial in prison in Arizona. Since I haven't been in touch with Colby, I really wanted to give him the space to have this interview be his story to tell. And I didn't want to comment on it until I knew that I had something valuable to add to the conversation. So I took a lot of time thinking about whether or not I wanted to comment and exactly what I wanted to say. And I believe that now I'm finally ready to speak about my feelings regarding this interview and to add something that will hopefully be helpful to the community who follows this case. My podcast, The Midlife Revolution, is largely about healing and moving forward after traumatic events. It's also about making small changes in our lives that can become revolutionary because every time we make a little change, it shakes something loose and other little things start to fall in place as well. Last July, I published a book called I Walked Through Fire to Get Here. It's the story of how I overcame the childhood trauma that I suffered and how I learned to identify and exit other abusive systems throughout my life. The book doesn't mention Lori at all or anything about that part of the family dynamics. It was written as a way for me to share my message with other trauma survivors in the hopes that they would realize that it's possible to heal and move on and have a beautiful life, even after terrible circumstances. In most of the podcast interviews that I did following my book release, I talked about identifying these kind of abusive systems and learning to understand how manipulators try to take advantage of people in all kinds of situations. When I first watched the video of Colby's interview with Lori, one of the things that stood out to me is all the different ways that she tries to manipulate people with her communication. I made a similar commentary about the body cam footage that was released during Chad Daybell's trial, where we see Lori interacting with officers after they come to her home to do a welfare check on JJ. So even though almost every channel that is following this case has already done a recap or an unpack of everything that happens in this phone call between Lori and Colby, I believe that what I can add is some commentary on pointing out Lori's manipulation. I frequently say that we all know somebody like Lori, somebody who puts on a veneer in public and acts a different way in private, somebody who lies to get their own way, and somebody who tries to manipulate people so that they get to be seen in the best possible light. I'm hopeful that people watching this video will be able to apply this knowledge to other relationships in their lives and learn to identify manipulative behaviors so that people who use these tactics can be called out for it and held accountable for their behavior. It's my sincere hope that the more people who learn how to do this, the more we become informed about how manipulators work and behave, we as a community can hopefully prevent further tragedies from happening. One of the tactics that many manipulators use is referred to as DARVO. This is something that a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists teach their patients. It's an acronym that stands for deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. And it's basically a situation where if I'm confronting a manipulator about their behavior, they will, first of all, deny that they've done anything wrong. Then they will attack me for pointing out their bad behavior. And then they will play the victim, essentially making me into the offender. This used to happen to me very often in my marriage, where I would bring up a concern that I had with my former spouse, and I would leave the conversation feeling like I was the one who had done something wrong. It was always very confusing to me, and I didn't understand what was happening. He would use this exact tactic by denying that he did anything wrong and then asking me, what about your bad behavior? Or what about this other thing that you did that one time? Then he would say how he felt about my behavior that hurt him. And I would listen honestly to what he had to say. And because I'm an empath, I would really examine my own behavior and think maybe I was the one who needed to change and I shouldn't have brought it up in the first place. I kept repeating this cycle of communication with him over and over because I had no idea what was going on. It wasn't until I was in therapy explaining these situations to my psychologist where she was able to point out this cycle of manipulative behavior and help give me the tools that I could use to not become manipulated again. I don't know if Colby has been to any kind of a therapy, but he does an excellent job of deflecting Lori's manipulations. He does not fall for it, and he has definitely become a very strong advocate for himself and his family and what is healthiest and best for them. I really want to commend Colby for his efforts on this interview. This could not have been easy for him to do, and we definitely see throughout the call his emotions and his discomfort and his anger and all of the things that come up when he's interacting with Lori. I'm very grateful that he did this interview because without it, we would still be left to wonder what Lori really does think. What is still going on in her mind? Does she still believe this? And I think this interview answers a lot of questions for people. That's one of the things that I also want to point out is where she is now and the likelihood that she may change in the future. It's obvious that Colby has done a lot of work to overcome all of the negative feelings that he has had throughout these last several years. I've been very impressed with his bravery as he has shown up to testify and talk with other people about these circumstances And I don't know if he knows how much it helps other people in the community to heal when they see him interacting with his family in a healthy and positive way and just enjoying being a father and a husband. I truly wish him all the best, and I am here supporting him every step of the way, even if we never communicate about it. There are some parts of the call that I'm not going to play just because I think a lot of people have already commented, and I'll give a little brief summary of those parts, but I'm not going to go through the entire thing. I'm just going to play the clips that are relevant to talking about Lori's manipulations and give a little bit of commentary on some of the things that she says. So if you haven't listened to the call yet, or you don't want to listen to it because it's too triggering or upsetting, this is a place where you can learn about what's said in the call without having to hear the whole thing. Although I am going to play some short clips of the call itself. And I'm also going to play some clips from the Hidden True Crime episode where Dr. John Matthias comments on many of the things that Lori says as well, just because as a licensed forensic psychiatrist, he does a much more concise job of explaining the psychology behind what Lori is doing much better than I could. I'm not any kind of a licensed mental health professional. I just tell people I'm an expert in my own trauma. The first thing that we hear on this call is Lori asking Colby about a comment that Colby made at one point where he said that Tylee had visited him in a dream. Lori's asking Colby, what did Tylee say to you? And the manipulation behind this is that she wants to know what Colby's story is, because before she talks about what Tylee said to her in a dream, she wants to know if what Tylee said to Colby conflicts at all with what Tylee said to Lori. Now, in the mainstream LDS church, there are plenty of examples of leaders of the church talking about times when they visited with or were visited by relatives who are deceased. It is absolutely a mainstream Mormon belief that we can communicate with our ancestors after they've died. The mainstream Mormon church also heavily believes in dreams and visions. There are many examples in the Book of Mormon of people having dreams and visions, and there are many examples of modern leaders talking about dreams that they had that were prophetic in nature. So this is not some kooky thing that Lori made up herself. This is something she would have been taught throughout her time in the Mormon church. Colby comments that he no longer believes that you can communicate with relatives who have passed on. He says that it's not biblical, and he tells Lori he doesn't really remember what Tylee said, and he doesn't really think that it was Tylee visiting him, just a dream that he had. Now that Lori knows that Colby's dream about Tylee isn't going to conflict with anything that she has to say, Lori feels safe to share with Colby what Tylee said to her when Tylee visited her in a dream. Throughout these video clips, it's important to watch Colby's reactions and his body language, just because it reinforces how strong he is against the manipulations of Lori. He's definitely not buying any of her BS, and he's definitely angry about the narrative that she is going to share with us.
Okay, yeah, but you called me, and so you knew something wasn't right, and you were questioning me, and you were asking, but this is before you knew anything, and you had had a dream with Tylee. I'm not saying she actually visited you, but you had had some kind of dream that had upset you, and I wondered, because she had passed away, if she had actually visited you and told you something, because she visited me and told me plenty of things, and the very first thing she told me was, "I'm sorry, Mom, for being such a brat." That's the first thing that she told me. And it was so Tylee, and it was so her. So I just wondered if she had said something to you that you recalled. And that was such a long time ago. I just always have wondered, because I never asked you at the time.
So this is obviously very upsetting to Colby. It's upsetting to all of us. First of all, that Lori would claim that Tylee was coming to visit the person who was involved in her death. And secondly, that Tylee would be apologizing to Lori for any reason whatsoever. It's obviously very upsetting to hear. We can see by Colby's reaction that he's angry and disgusted by what Lori says. We also hear Lori laughing after making that comment in an effort to diffuse the tension that's obviously created by this kind of a narrative. She then continues to jabber on and on, Manipulators are often really uncomfortable with silence because they don't want you thinking too much about your response. So they're going to continue talking over and over until you do respond in some way. Colby goes on to tell Lori how he feels about multiple probations. He doesn't believe that that's a biblical teaching, and he makes it clear to her that he doesn't believe what Lori says about this being one of her multiple probations. Lori's response is to basically say that the Bible is enough for most people, and if they don't need to know about multiple probations, then they'll never learn about it. She says that for most people, one life is enough. But for those people who are charged with a special mission, they're the ones who get to learn that doctrine. People who don't need to know it never do. Colby asks her what her beliefs are about demons possessing people and zombies. And Lori takes this opportunity to point out something that she's probably been thinking about for a very long time. She tells Colby that if you go through all of her iCloud discovery from the last 19 years, that there's only one instance of the word zombie that comes up, and it's when JJ was searching for a toy he wanted to order. Now, this is a technicality because it's true that in Lori's emails and her text messages, the full word zombie is never spelled out, although she does make reference to Z's. And we have a story from Melanie Gibb when she was on the phone with Lori at one point where Lori refers to Tylee as a zombie. And Tylee responds, "Not me, Mom." So Lori is using a technicality to try and advance her narrative that she never said anything about zombies and that her beliefs have been wildly portrayed as inaccurate. This is another technique that manipulators use to keep you guessing and to gaslight you from what you know to be true. It puts you in a position where you sort of have to think back and wonder, where did I get the idea that Lori believed in zombies? And then it sort of forces you to come up with the evidence that Lori is lying now about never having used that term. A real life example of this that might more frequently occur in someone's life is, for example, if you're talking to your boss and he says, "Why didn't you schedule that conference call?" And you tell your boss, "Well, you told me that you wanted to have a meeting in the conference room." And he says, "No, I said conference call," when clearly in your notes it says conference room. So people will sometimes use words in a different way to try and absolve themselves of taking responsibility where they might have made a mistake or from admitting something that you're accusing them of. Lori does say that she believes in casting out spirits, just like it happens in the New Testament. And she does say that she has the power to do that. She references a episode of the series The Chosen. This is a TV series that is put out by Angel Studios, which coincidentally or not, is the same studio that produced the movie The Sound of Freedom, which portrays the story of Tim Ballard, as far as he tells it, about how he became a person involved in quote unquote rescuing children from trafficking. Tim Ballard was very publicly excommunicated from the Mormon Church for claiming that he had a connection with M. Russell Ballard, who was one of the apostles or leaders of the LDS Church. Tim Ballard has also been accused of lots of different improprieties with women that he worked with in Operation Underground Railroad, and he has several lawsuits pending against him. Now, he has not yet been charged with or convicted of a crime, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the things that are put forth in these lawsuits are correct, and that's a rabbit hole for another time. But if you're interested in it, you can go over to the channel Nuance Ho here on YouTube. She and a former partner of Tim Ballard's do a lot of work to detail some of the things that Tim Ballard has done during his career and his time at Operation Underground Railroad. So about 9 minutes into the phone call, Colby finally asks Lori what did happen to his siblings, and that's part of the call that I do want to play.
I wanted to give you the floor to really say your piece, and since we're cutting out so much, maybe it's just a good time. You told me one day you'd want to say it in our last phone call. You said that you wanted to tell me what has happened. So I'm going to just give you the floor real quick. If you want to say your piece, and maybe I'll just have follow-up questions after that. But I want to go ahead, and I think you know what I'm referring to is what really happened then with my brother and my sister and this whole thing. And I know that we could talk about my dad, but I'm assuming that that's because of your case is a little not for right now. We can always follow up on that at some point because I do have a lot of questions about it all. But I'm going to try to just keep it strictly to my brother and my sister. So I just want to give you the floor real quick, and I think we'll just kind of go from there.
Well, it's obviously different than what everyone else thinks, and I don't know that if you knew the truth of what really actually happened, if you would want it to be in public forum, Colby. I mean, talk to you personally. I know that you are the only person on this planet, to me, who loved Tylee and JJ as much as I do. The only person. So in all of my 4 years or 5 years of going through this, because it's been 5 years now,
Yeah.
I have asked every one of my attorneys, how can you help me to talk to Colby in a way that I can let him know the truth of what happened, because he's the only person on this planet, not my mom, not my sister, not anybody else. Colby is the only person on this planet who loved JJ and Tylee like I did.
Now, Lori is already coming in with the manipulation techniques here. She is love bombing Colby. She's trying to make him feel important. She's trying to give him an ego boost. And it's not enough for her to just say, Colby, I know you're the only person who loved Tylee and JJ like I did. She has to pause and add descriptive terms and reiterate things over and over. And this is one clue to you that somebody's trying to be manipulative. If they don't speak in clear and concise terms, for example, what Lori is saying, that you, Colby, are the only person in the entire world. She's adding and embellishing. She doesn't need to add those extra words or those pauses. She just needs to say that Colby was the only person, but she continues to re-explain and be very descriptive and add unnecessary words to her narrative.
He was the only person that truly cared. And in my opinion, he is the only person who deserves to know what really happened. So can you help me find a way where I can talk to Colby privately and tell him, because this is a horrible situation and I want to be able to talk to you, but I don't know that after you know what actually happened, if you would want that to be public.
Okay. Well, basically, you said no one was murdered.
So I just want to point out some of Colby's body language while Lori continues to sort of pontificate about Colby being the only person who needs to know the truth. He's very uncomfortable. He obviously just wants her to get to the point, and she's not directly answering the question. He asked a very concise question, what actually happened? And she, instead of answering that question, goes on a narrative about how she tried to get the information to him. This is an avoidance technique, and it's something that manipulators use when they don't want to tell you the truth, or when they're still kind of trying to make up the story in their head or come up with something to say that is going to keep them in your good graces.
That was your biggest statement. You said not one single person was murdered, that everybody, you said there were suicides and deaths, accidental deaths, and you said that there was drug overdoses, that no one was murdered. So that's what I'm going to ask you then. If you were willing to say it in your statement, then I'm asking you to say it to me. If you don't want to go into detail, that's your decision. But that's what I'm asking you today.
Well, what I can tell you is that I wrote out what happened with those 38 pages, and that's what I was telling my attorneys. I need this to get to Colby.
Again, Lori doesn't directly answer the question here. She goes on talking about the pages that she wrote, instead of answering Colby's, again, direct question of what happened. She starts talking about how much she wrote and getting the information to her attorneys. She's avoiding the question for a second time now.
I think it's fair to Colby to not have this information, since he is the only person I feel like was as close to that cared about JJ and Tylee like I did. Now, you are the only person, Colby, in the entire world that I felt like I said, I want to talk to Colby and tell him because he deserves to know. I don't care what anybody else knows, and I frankly don't care what anybody else thinks. It's not.
Again, she is doubling down, stroking Colby's ego, saying that he's the only person that deserves to know. She's just reiterating something that she's said before in the past, and she's avoiding answering the actual question once again.
Their children, they're my children, and they're your brother and sister, and we were the family, and we were the ones doing everything for them. And when you took care of JJ, when Tylee was in the hospital that time before we had to move to Hawaii, and you sat there with him as a 2-year-old with before medication, before we knew he had autism, and he would just run like 100 miles an hour.
I just want to pause for another moment here, because obviously Colby gets emotional when Lori starts talking about JJ. And this is obviously really difficult for him. But what Lori is doing here is she's feigning some emotion. And I don't know if it's obvious to the rest of you, but she is faking it, trying to pretend like she's emotional, but she isn't actually emotional. Now, we can't see her face, and so we can't look for some of the other markers of heightened emotion, like changes in facial color or tears or any of that. But because I studied vocal performance as a master's student, one of the things that we talked about is ways to change your vocal production to make different sounds. And if you just enlarge the back part of your throat and change the pitch of your voice to go a little bit more into the nasal cavity, you can make it sound like you're getting emotional, even if you're not getting emotional. This is something that they teach actors and opera singers so that we can portray an emotion that we're not actually feeling. So it sounds like the difference between talking like this and talking like this, where we can pretend that we're emotional, but we're not actually. It's obvious to me just because I've heard Lori do this a lot before, but maybe it's something you can continue to listen for throughout the rest of this phone call.
This up, and you were so mad at me when you picked me up with JJ, and you're like, what are you doing? And you're too old to be, you're a grandma age, and you're too old to have this baby, and what are you doing? And he's gonna have so many problems, and you were really mad. And JJ came with his own love, and you fell in love with JJ.
This is another tactic that manipulators use. Lori's trying to tell Colby how he felt. She is recalling these experiences, which may or may not be accurate. We can't tell by Colby's response if this is an accurate portrayal or not. But if it is accurate, she's not telling Colby anything he doesn't know. He was there for these events and circumstances. And this may be Lori's version. She may see it differently than Colby, but she's trying to get her narrative out there by convincing Colby of what she remembers. She tells Colby, you loved JJ. So if this wasn't already on Colby's mind, the manipulator is basically trying to get this person to feel an emotion that they may or may not have felt. Again, it's just Lori trying to put her narrative out there. We don't know if this is what Colby believes or what he feels or what he felt at the time, but this is what Lori wants Colby to believe about that time and about what happened.
Colby did, and when you had to take care of him during that time, I think that bonded you the most to him. When you took care of him, and Tylee and I were in the hospital, and Charles was in Hawaii trying to set up the house, and we were trying to move out of that huge 5,000 square foot house, and we were just throwing everything in the dumpster because we couldn't move it. We didn't have time because we didn't expect Tylee to be with pancreatitis in the hospital, and I was in there with her screaming. And
again, it's been almost 4 minutes since Colby asked his initial question, and Lori is nowhere near giving us an answer.
And so you are the only person that deserves to know the truth. Also, I can't tell the story of what happened to Tylee and JJ without telling Tylee's life. And I don't necessarily want to tell that to the public, but you know it. You are the only person who lived it with me and her. You lived it with me. You went with me and her to therapy every week. You were the ones there where she was crying and screaming and throwing things in walls because they were forcing her to go to jail. You saw all of her moods. You knew how she was had depression and anxiety attacks. And you and Kelsey were even coming over to mentor her during that time. You know, because you were there. And you were there with JJ. You were there with Tylee.
I think Lori is basically at this point trying to get Colby to remember that maybe Tylee had some mental health issues. And by her telling Colby, you know, she's essentially presenting her narrative the way that she sees it and trying to get Colby to adopt it as the truth. This is a form of gaslighting because it may be different than the way that Colby remembers it. But obviously, this is what Lori wants Colby to believe. So she tells him that he knows it.
I didn't want to write it out like that. I didn't want to just say, oh, this is what happened. I wanted to talk to you and answer your questions so I can tell you everything that actually happened. And if you have a question of something, well, the police said this, and I have an answer for that. That is not what they weren't there and they don't know. So I wanted to talk to you so I could hear your questions and answer your questions because you are the only person besides me on this whole earth who really loved both of them the way that I did. And so you heard what happened if you heard that.
So Colby's obviously frustrated that she's come back once again to saying that Colby is the only person who loved Tylee and JJ. This is something she's reiterated several times. She still hasn't answered the question. Colby's getting frustrated. And again, it's just a manipulation tactic for her to go on and on about this narrative rather than answering the question. She obviously doesn't want to answer the question. I don't know if that's because she knows that what she is about to tell Colby is not true, but it's her version of the truth. It's possible that she may just be afraid of Colby's reaction. And this is what proves to me that she really needs Colby at this time. Colby's the only one who really is left. We know that sometimes her mom talks to her, but I think this is her only opportunity to reach Colby and to connect with him and get him to understand her side of the story or believe her side of the story so that they can continue to have, so that they can have a relationship.
They wouldn't give me the detail really. So that's why I'm asking, because I that's what.
Yeah, I would be happy to tell you personally and privately because I don't know if you want those details out in the public.
Well, you pretty much said it in the trial. So I guess I'm wondering why you said those things if you weren't willing to just share if that's the truth. If that's the truth that you say it is.
Well, it is the truth. And it's exactly what happened, but
do you want me to say what I've seen personally?
Sure.
So
I'm going to stop the recording there because Colby goes on to describe in great detail what was shared during the trial, the evidence and the photos and everything that proves that Lori's version of events is not true. Now, when Colby references and says that you pretty much said it during the trial, he's talking about Lori's allocution statement, where Lori claims that no one was murdered, that accidental deaths happen, that suicides happen, and that nobody was murdered. So Colby wants her explanation of what did she mean by that. So Colby ends by telling Lori that they found pieces of Tylee, and this is Lori's response to that comment.
Can you imagine why that is? Do you have any room to think that would happen?
no.
So did you know Tylee's desire of wanting to be cremated?
That was your version of cremating her? That was
It wasn't mine.
Because that doesn't sound.
It wasn't mine. But did you know that she had that desire?
No.
Well, so you don't know because you weren't there, but after Charles passed away, and Alex and I and Tylee were at our table in there at the house in Chandler, and we were going over Charles' wishes, and Charles had put all his stuff down saying he wanted to be cremated, and don't ever put me in a box or I'll come back and haunt you, because he was claustrophobic. He didn't like the idea of being in a box, and he had said all these funny things on his letter to me. And Tylee said to me and Alex at the time, she said, don't you put me in a box either. She said, whenever I'm out of here, I want to be cremated. That was her big thing.
So why wasn't she cremated? Why didn't you cremate her?
This is obviously a very disturbing narrative for Lori to put forward. But she's using the same tactic that she did at the beginning of the call, where she's asking a test question. She's asking Colby if he was aware that Tylee wanted to be cremated. Now, of course, he pushes back because Tylee was not cremated. But Lori's testing to see what Colby's response is going to be to her question. And then her next comments are going to be based on what Colby says. This is a manipulation tactic, again, that I referenced in the beginning of the video, because Lori's about to tell a story, but she doesn't want to tell a story that's going to contradict something that Colby knows for sure. So if Colby had a conversation with Tylee and Tylee said that she never wanted to be cremated, Lori's going to have some kind of a narrative that she's going to add to her already invented story that is going to assuage Colby's doubts about anything that Lori is going to have to say. So when Colby says no, that he wasn't aware that that was Tylee's wish, Lori's first comment is, well, you don't know because you weren't there, but let me tell you, here's the story. This is something that manipulators do all the time. They will reference something that is unverifiable. There's no way for us to fact check this story, mainly because all the people she mentions in this story are dead. Charles is dead, Tylee's dead, and Alex is dead. There's no way for us to fact check this. So she's invented a circumstance where Colby wasn't there, and Lori has an opportunity now to tell her side of the story or put out her narrative because she knows nobody can prove her wrong. Now, I personally don't know if the letter that she references coming from Charles were actually his final wishes or not. I haven't dug through enough of the FOIA documents to know if such a letter exists or was released. But you can be sure that whatever the letter actually does contain, if it conflicts with Lori's version of events at all, she's not going to tell us that. Also, you can see Colby's disgust when Lori refers to Charles as passing away. He did not pass away. He was shot and killed. That's actually a fact that Lori doesn't dispute ever, but probably because of the upcoming trial, she's still going to refer to it as passing away. The next thing that Colby points out is that he has the ashes of Tylee and JJ, and that's cremation. But what Lori's referring to is definitely not cremation. So he's asking her, please, to explain the events again.
Can you imagine coming in on that scene? Can you imagine as a mother, your father now? So imagine you come in and find.
Okay, so Lori asks Colby a question before she's even explained anything that has happened. So she's asking him an unanswerable question. And this is something that manipulators do all the time. They know that you're not going to have a response. The tactic here is just to confuse you and keep you on your heels, because what they're about to share with you is probably something that you're either not going to believe or something that is not going to agree with what the official narrative is. So Lori asks Colby, can you imagine coming in on that scene when she hasn't even described to him what the scene was in the first place? Then she tries to relate to him by appealing to him as a father. And she says, I'm a mother, you're a father. Can you as a father imagine coming in and finding your children? So she's trying to get Colby to identify with her and relate to her on some level. Again, a tactic.
Trying to understand you.
You can't, because you can't imagine what that is like. You can't even imagine, you know how much I love those kids. You know how much I've put into them. You know how much I've done everything to protect them. You know how much I've done everything to get Tylee every kind of help spot.
So again, she is telling Colby how he feels, telling him that he couldn't possibly imagine what it was like to come in on that scene. She's basically trying to make herself the victim now by saying that she is misunderstood and nobody really knows what it's like. And there's no way that Colby could possibly relate to her or understand. Colby says, I'm trying to understand you. And she immediately shoots back with, because you can't. There's no way for you to understand how I feel.
In every kind of court to keep her safe, fought in every kind of hospital so they wouldn't do a whole bunch of horrible stuff to her when she was sick all the time. You know what I did for them.
I know.
So you imagine walking in, finding them, and they had been gone for hours. There is nothing I can do, even though you just can't imagine. You can't imagine that scenario because it's a believe that you can't imagine that scenario.
So here I just want to point out that Lori starts to elevate the emotions again, pretend that she's getting emotional, but instead of crying, she actually expels this huff of frustration because she can't get emotional about it. She's not actually emotional about it. She's frustrated at trying to explain this to Colby because she knows that Colby's not buying it.
And when I came in and I knew Tylee had been upset, and I knew that she was upset with me that weekend because she wouldn't stay in the house because Melanie Gibb would stay there. She hates Melanie Gibb, as you know. Everyone knows this. She hated her. And she couldn't stand her smell because she had the essential oils, and Tylee got sick off the essential oils in 6th grade because her teacher made her drink the essential oils in 6th grade to help her.
Now, Lori has gone off on a rabbit hole here. She is providing a lot of details that are inconsequential to the matter at hand, and she's going around in a circle rather than actually describing what happened. She's already put out a vague idea of finding the children, but rather than describing the scene that she came upon, she goes off on a tangent talking about how Tylee didn't like essential oils, didn't like Melanie Gibb, and she's going to ramble on for a little bit longer with some of these added extra superfluous things rather than focusing on the story. And I can't comment on whether this is something that is common among all people who tell lies, but I know this about Lori, and I've experienced it with some other manipulative people as well. They will give you a lot of details about everything other than the question that you actually asked. And then they'll be very vague about describing anything that you can fact check or prove wrong. As a PTSD survivor, I can definitely attest to the fact that I have reacted in different ways to different traumatic circumstances. Some traumatic events I remember with great detail, and other traumatic events are a little bit more foggy to me. So I don't want to say that's impossible for someone to be vague in their description of a traumatic event, because that is a reaction that some people have. Our brains have a way of protecting our psyche from really horrific details sometimes. But the changes in the tone of Lori's voice, especially when she says Tylee hated Melanie. Everyone knows this. Everybody knows this. When she changes that tone of voice and that manner of speaking, the cadence changes. She's definitely embellishing, and she's putting emphasis on something that really doesn't matter in this extremely consequential conversation that she's having with Colby, where if she really wanted to have a relationship with him, she could just describe everything in detail as it actually was, and then accept his response authentically. Instead, she's going off on tangents and not really focusing on what's important here. She's going to ramble on and give some more information that's not really consequential to the discussion that we're having. So I'm going to fast forward through a little bit.
Lead to this? How could it possibly have happened? Why and how? Why and how? I mean, you can't even imagine what that is like. No one on earth can imagine what that's like.
You're telling me that Tylee took JJ's life and then took her own life?
On accident.
And took her own life then? After? So who chopped and burned her? And who duct taped JJ and put him in the ground? What I'm asking you. You're saying what? So you told me.
Sorry, you're just cutting out. I can't hear what your question is.
This part is really important to observe because Colby essentially repeats the story that Lori has put forward as the official narrative and then asks her to confirm if that's true. And if you listen closely, she gives a big exhale and then she starts to answer by saying, I, and then another big exhale, and then the video cuts. I think what happened there is that there probably were some noise issues over the phone and the audio was cutting out. So Colby skipped over that part for us and got back to where he was able to hear Lori again. When Lori comes back in, she asks him to repeat the question. She says, I didn't hear your question, which is a lie. She did hear the question. She started to answer it. And then the phone started to cut out. So she uses this as an opportunity to get Colby to repeat the question. She already knows what the question is. So while Colby's repeating, she's going to continue to think of an answer that is going to be something that's the most plausible to Colby, and that's going to try and maintain their connection. A very obvious manipulator technique. When you ask someone a direct question and they use a delay tactic like this, I had a family member who would say, huh? Every time I asked them a question, as if they didn't hear me. So I would start to repeat the question, but then in the middle of my repetition, they would begin to respond. It was an obvious delay tactic because they didn't wait for me to finish repeating the question before they began their response. And I started to pick up on this. And when they would say, huh, I would just sit there silently and wait for them to respond because I knew there was no problem with their hearing. They heard my question. They were just trying to think of an acceptable response. And this is what Lori's doing here. It's clearly manipulative.
JJ's life, then took her own life. And then someone cremated her by dismembering her and burning her and throwing her in a pet cemetery. And then somebody bound JJ, put him in a trash bag, and threw him in the backyard. And that was it. That was the end of it.
What I'm saying is I wasn't aware what happened to them after I left that scene.
Okay, so you gave it to someone else. You gave the responsibility to someone else, is what you're saying.
Correct.
Okay. And then
I didn't. I just ran out.
okay. So you're saying someone else took care of the situation.
Yes.
In case you missed that last part, that was Lori confirming, correct. She gave the responsibility to someone else. And then just a minute later, she says, and then Colby reiterates, so you let someone else take care of it. And Lori says, I didn't. I ran out because I couldn't handle it. So she goes back on her initial response. First, she confirms what Colby says is correct. And then she goes back and says, no, I didn't. I just ran out because I couldn't handle it. I think Lori doesn't want Colby to believe that she escaped the responsibility of taking care of the kids at that time.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
I said you.
It's freaking out.
I'm saying that you're saying to me that someone else took care of it. That's it. Then I don't have to go into more detail there. Somebody else took care of these things. So you.
Correct.
Okay. Okay.
I'm telling you that their spirits were gone from their bodies at that time. They were gone. They were already in heaven. They were already gone.
So to me, this begs the question of why Lori believes that this is the appropriate narrative. I think she grasped at straws to find a story that she could live with, that also absolves her of any guilt and that makes her look the best that she possibly can. But let's think about this for a second. Let's pretend for a second that Lori's version of events is anything close to the truth. She believes that their spirits were gone at this point. But we also know that she was telling people that Tylee and JJ were safe and happy. Did she mean that they were safe and happy in heaven? It brings up so many questions if we even start to consider that it's hypothetically true, because the appropriate thing to do in that situation obviously would have been to call the police. Lori's going to offer some explanation of why she behaved the way that she did.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay. So you're saying that they were gone, and why, if that's the case, then why wouldn't you just tell us? What was there secrecy for? Why didn't anybody know?
There's a lot of reasons. Colby and I've gone over that a million times, and I can tell you from the beginning.
So here again, Lori doesn't answer a direct question that Colby asked her. She just says, there are a million reasons, and I've gone over all of them a million times. No, I'm sorry. She says there are lots of reasons. I've gone over them a million times. It would be very simple for her to just answer the question. But again, she's obfuscating, she's delaying. She doesn't want to give a direct answer to this question. She continues to dance around, and then she says something that is very consequential.
You're telling me that all of this is to protect my sister's name because of what she did. Is that what you're saying?
In my mind, yes.
So Lori's narrative is that Tylee is at fault. It was an accident, but then she was mad at Lori, and so this is why she did this. And then the reason that Lori acted the way she did, letting someone else take care of handling the children's remains, was to protect Tylee from scrutiny that she might have received afterwards, to protect her from the consequences that she might have received, or to protect her name, or to protect her reputation. It's infuriating to hear this because all evidence that we've seen throughout the entirety of Tylee's life is that Lori never protected her. Lori used her at every possible opportunity to get what Lori wanted. It is definitely a trait of people with narcissistic tendencies to consider their relationships with other people as transactional. And we saw this throughout Tylee's life. She used Tylee to get a divorce from Joe Ryan and to put out the narrative that he was the bad guy. And then we later found out that Tylee was coached. There's more that I could say about this, but I actually think a much better explanation is given by Dr. John Mathias. So I'm going to switch over to the Hidden True Crime episode where they unpacked this phone call and listen to Dr. John's description of why Lori puts forth this narrative that Tylee was to blame.
If I'm talking about something that I know to be accurate, I'm usually not going to say in my mind. I'm going to describe it the way I believe it occurred because I think that's accurate. So when you say in my mind, you're qualifying it. And that would suggest that there's a part of her that knows it's not completely accurate. I think she's convinced herself at some level. So to answer your question, it's not an all or none answer. Does she believe? Yeah, I think she believes to some degree. She's delusional. Does she believe completely? Does she know in her heart, at the deepest subconscious level, that Tylee was not responsible for these murders? Yes, she probably knows that. And that's why she qualifies a lot of her answers with, in my mind. In my mind, this is how it happened. Well, what about in somebody else's mind? What about in the mind of your defense attorney? What about in the mind of Chad Daybell? What about in the mind of law enforcement, right? It's a peculiar way to represent the story. And it would suggest that at some level she knows this is how she sees it, and therefore it may not necessarily be true.
Why blame it on Tylee and not Alex? Alex is deceased too. She could simply say, Alex accidentally killed JJ. Alex did this, and why Tylee?
Yeah, right. It's the same reason that Tylee comes to her and says, "I'm sorry for being such a brat," because Tylee's oppositional. In Lori's mind, Tylee's oppositional, which I'm sure any parent of a normal teenager would expect from their child, some oppositionality. That's part of being a teenager. They're growing up. They're trying to figure out who they are. But Alex Cox was a loyal warrior. Alex Cox was given a blessing by Chad Daybell. Alex Cox carried out their mission and their vision. Tylee opposed it. Tylee fought back. She questioned Chad. Therefore, she's labeled a brat, right? There's a moment here, I'm going to read this during the interview, where Lori says, Tylee was upset. I'm paraphrasing. I didn't write this down verbatim. Tylee was upset. She hated Melanie Gibb. She asked to babysit JJ. Tylee did it to get back at me.
To get back at me.
That's why she visited. So she says after that, she visited me to tell me it wasn't my fault. So why Tylee?
Because Tylee was oppositional. Tylee saw through Lori. She saw through Chad. She started to push back. And that's why Lori had to blame her for what happened. Dr. John goes on to talk about how important Lori's mission was to her and that it was more important than anything else. And we'll come back to that in just a little bit. I want to get to how Colby responded to what Lori said here. Colby goes on to share with Lori that he's seen the evidence, he's talked to the prosecutors, and he's come to a completely different conclusion than this narrative that Lori's putting out. Essentially explains to her that he doesn't believe her and that he saw the condition of the bodies afterwards, and it just doesn't make sense. Lori then references the near-death experience that she talked about in her allocution statement. And she says, because I've been dead, I can tell you, you don't care what happens to your body after you die. Colby's reaction to this is, again, just anger and disgust. We all know that Lori did not have a near-death experience. That was an invention. Colby says to her, I don't want to hear it. And Lori says, neither do I. She reiterates to Colby her narrative that there was no bag, there was no duct tape, that was done to JJ long after Lori found them. Here is some of Colby's excellent pushback where he really differentiates from his mom. He breaks away from any sort of a parent and child role relationship. And I think this is where we see a lot of Colby's strength. And I greatly admire his ability to just be silent and let Lori convict herself with her own words here. He's able to really regulate the emotions that he must be feeling, which I'm sure are very difficult. This was my probably 5th or 6th time listening to the phone call, and it still makes me emotional. So I can't imagine the restraint that Colby had to exercise just to let Lori talk and get these words out there.
I was never going to tell anybody anything about anything, ever.
Okay, so you would have never told me. You would have never told
But
me.
when I was at the
You would have never told
you're
me.
the only person I wanted to tell you, and you're the only person I wanted to tell, and I wanted that to be privately.
Say, well,
The only person I deserve to know.
that can't just be something private, Mom. It's not something you can just tell me that I would just be accepting and understanding of. You have to understand that. I would never agree with you. I would never bury my siblings in some random dude's backyard and act like it never happened. I would never let that happen. I would have, even if that's what happened, which I'm going to be honest with you, I hope you can understand, because I wanted to be respectful enough to listen to what you said. I've really tried to listen and study what you've said, and based off of everything that I've been shown, that they were both murdered, and that's what you said didn't happen. So I think that we're not going to get anywhere there. I think that's just, I wanted to hear what you had to say, because you said you were there, and you said that those were your children, those were my siblings, but I can't sit here and say that I agree with you at all. I don't think that's what happened.
Colby does have some more questions for Lori, and I want to skip ahead a little bit to get to those, because I think it's very important to understand Lori's frame of mind now, and does she still believe it?
Obviously, I have a million. Trying to keep this very, really to the point of the things. I think that I've noticed you say you have a lot of these enemies, and that you have believed to be a very big usher into the second coming and Jesus and all these things. So I'm wondering, do you feel that you are this person who's lived multiple lives and is here to do this thing to usher in Jesus's coming? Is that what all of this hardship on your part is? Is that why you think you're going through so much hardship? Is that you are that person?
Well, what do you remember me telling you about my experiences in the temple?
Again, here, Lori answers a question with a question. She's, again, testing the waters to see what Colby remembers, to see if it agrees with what she's about to tell him. Lori does not want to get into an argument or to have pushback from Colby. That feels very dangerous for her. So she's always going to confirm what he knows, what he remembers first, before she starts to put out a version of her own version of events.
Told you personally. I only told a few people personally, and they've gone running wild with these stories. So I'm asking you what you remember, what I told you personally.
All I remember is your biggest claim is that you had seen Jesus personally, and that he had talked to you, and that he was on your side. That was it. That's what I really remember. I mean, you did tell me about the whole multiple lives thing, but that's about the basis of what I remember you telling me.
Right. And where did I tell you where that experience happened?
Yeah, you said you're in the temple. That's what
okay. So I learned all these things that I know from Jesus personally. So when he came to me in the temple and he put his hands on my head and ordained me to do something for him, like a job, right? And he said, will you do this job if you lose everything? This was in 2017.
Okay.
And then he said, will you do this job if you become like Job?
So obviously, Lori claiming that she personally was visited by Jesus Christ is deeply offensive to anybody who believes in Jesus Christ. However, this is not some kooky belief that Lori came up with. The mainstream LDS church teaches that Jesus Christ comes to his temples often. The LDS people believe that the LDS temples, are the literal house of the Lord, and that when they are full of righteous people who are doing the work of the Lord, that he comes to the temple and visits. Now, a lot of members believe this is somewhat metaphorical, meaning that you can feel the presence of Jesus Christ, but I don't think any of us ever expected to actually see him there. But that idea is never refuted or dismissed by the leaders of the church. And in fact, there's a ceremony called the Second Anointing, which is a secret ceremony in the LDS faith that is only participated in by invitation of church leadership. Now, all of the presidency of the church, the quorum of the 12 apostles, everybody who you see sitting on the stand during General Conference, those are the leaders of the church. Those are the people that we assume to have taken part in this second anointing ritual. In this ritual references a scripture in the Doctrine and Covenants where Joseph Smith talks about someone having their calling and election made sure. And in this narrative, you literally will see the face of Jesus. Again, most of us think that this means when this life is over. Most members of the LDS Church don't know about the second anointing because it is a secret ceremony only reserved for the top leadership of the church. But there's a very interesting episode on Mormon Stories where one of the people who has undergone this ceremony believed that they were literally going to see Jesus in the temple, and then was disappointed when it actually didn't happen. And the apostle who was presiding over that ceremony reminded him that maybe this was a metaphorical knowing Jesus personally and getting to be in his presence. But Lori claiming that she saw Jesus in the temple really isn't so outlandish when you think of those teachings that happen in the second anointing. If there is a leader of the church who believed that he really was literally going to see Jesus during this anointing ceremony, it's just not so far-fetched for Lori to believe that Jesus visited her in the temple. But it's obviously deeply offensive to other Christians, and I believe Colby is a Christian, and it's deeply offensive to him to believe that Jesus Christ would have visited his mother personally, laid his hands on her head, and gave her a mission. Then she also compares herself to Job. She says that the suffering that she's going through, the persecution, the way she's been vilified in the media, the fact that she's in prison, all of these things are happening to her because Jesus had a special mission for her and told her that she was going to have to suffer just like Job did. Dr. John Matthias has a lot more insight into this particular part of Lori's story, so I want to go back to their episode to hear what he has to say.
Tylee opposed her, and Tylee opposed Chad Daybell. Because another fascinating part about this interview, and we've seen this repeatedly with Lori, is she says that Jesus visited her multiple times. She compares herself to Job. Jesus tells her, you have a job to do. Presumably that job is to carry out the mission of establishing the New Jerusalem with Chad Daybell. You have a mission to do, Lori. You're going to encounter Lucifer. You're going to encounter all these obstacles, but you need to do this. It's going to create a tremendous amount of suffering. You're going to be just like Job, but you need to carry out this mission. So the mission, we talked about this years ago on our first podcast. The mission is more important than anything else. It still is to Lori. Sitting in prison as a convicted murderer, she still talks about how important the mission is and how she's Job and she was put there to carry out this mission.
So I learned all these things that I know from Jesus personally. So when he came to me in the temple and he put his hands on my head and ordained me to do something for him, like a job, right? And he said, will you do this job if you lose everything? This was in 2017.
Okay.
And then he said, will you do this job if you become like Job? That's what he asked me. And at the time, when he was right there with me, and you have those wonderful, heavenly, peaceful feelings, I thought, sure, I'll do anything you want me to. Go to the ends of the earth. I'll follow you to the ends of the earth like Peter. And then you walk into that scene and you're on the ground like Peter. Like, what is this about? What do you mean lose everything? I lost. Jesus gave me a job.
Okay.
Lucifer has done every single thing to get me to take my own life. Because that is his goal. If I leave here, I cannot do my job for Jesus, right? The only thing I have to do for Jesus is stay here, right? He needs me here to help people.
Right.
Now, there's eight women in my pod right now facing the death penalty. Okay, 8 women in this little jail. I help them every day.
Okay.
I help them doing their workouts. I help them doing all these things. I help them with their cases. Whether Jesus needs me to help him and serve him in primary or in prison, he asked me to do this for him.
And that's one reason why Tylee gets scapegoated and not Alex Cox, because Alex Cox was on board with that mission. Tylee was not. Tylee pushed back against the mission. She pushed back against Chad Daybell. She probably thought a lot of this was nonsense. Tylee was smart. She saw through this. She saw through Chad Daybell. So it's she's a very accessible and easy person to scapegoat because she wasn't a true believer. So given a choice between scapegoating Alex Cox, which yes, the evidence is much more consistent with pointing the finger at Alex Cox, she's not going to do that because Alex Cox was given a blessing by Chad Daybell and Tylee was not. Tylee is not a loyal soldier. She needs to be vilified. She needs to be put in her place. But it's over the top to suggest that Tylee came back to her in a dream and said, "Hey, Mom, don't worry about it. You're not at fault. I was a brat. I was to blame for everything. And by the way, thanks for murdering me. I really appreciate it. Thanks for taking my life, Mom. I trusted you to protect me." But I mean, of course, she left that part out.
Is a scapegoat another way of saying Tylee was dark? Is that what she's essentially implying still? Tylee is still dark? A brat?
Yeah, I think she still believes that. I mean, yeah, a scapegoat is just it's a way for her, again, it's a projection. It's a way for her to put all of these difficult and painful emotions onto someone and something else rather than accept responsibility for them. So rather than say, I murdered or I played a role in the murders of my children, which she can't say, she can't accept that, she can't come to terms with that, she has to say something else. So Tylee becomes that scapegoat, becomes that vehicle through which she can express her inexpressible feelings.
Thank you, Dr. John. Thank you for helping us to try to understand what's going on in Lori's mind. There's one interesting thing that Lori said that I actually think is truthful somewhat. She said that Lucifer's doing everything that he can to make me take my life because if I'm not here on the earth, then I can't do my mission. She made reference to Jesus visiting her in the temple. She then later says that because there needs to be opposition in all things, that Satan also visits her, tells her he knows exactly who she is. And I do believe probably that Lori has had some moments of clarity and introspection where she does want to take her life because that is the only way that she could deal with accepting the truth and the reality of what she actually did and how she was actually involved. I want to go back to Colby for another part of this call.
To get me to take my own life because that is his goal. If I leave here, I cannot do my job for Jesus, right? The only thing I have to do for Jesus is stay here, right? He needs me here to help people. Right now, there's eight women in my pod right now facing the death penalty. Okay, 8 women in this little jail. I help them every day. I help them doing their workouts. I help them doing all these things. I help them with their cases. Whether Jesus needs me to help him and serve him in primary or in prison, he asked me to do this for him. Now, the media flood that has come again.
I also think that it's really interesting that Lori talks about her little pod in prison and these other women who are on death row and Lori helping them with their workouts and everything else. I know that Lori was, when she was competing in the Mrs. Texas pageant, that she did a lot of hard work to sort of transform her physique to be more muscular, to be more toned. And obviously she was a hairdresser, so I'm sure that she is probably holding court in prison with these women. I'm sure that she views herself as the matriarch of this little pod, and she's probably teaching anybody who will listen about these crazy beliefs. I have been in touch with at least 2 people who have texted her or are texting with her. They have their little iPads in there, and she has a lot of contact with people on the outside. She's able to email and text, and she can teach them her crazy beliefs too. I don't know whether anybody who is in touch with her actually believes what she's teaching, or if she's sending them out to other contacts that she has that also believe Chad. But this is another one of the reasons why I continue to talk about this case, because I know for a fact that there are other groups out there with similar teachings to Chad Daybell. There are lots of groups that are on the fringes of the mainstream LDS church who are going out there creating their own theology, their own spirituality. Some of them are on the side of the spectrum where they believe that the church leadership has gone astray. And so they're taking Joseph Smith's teachings and creating sort of their own version of the religion. And then there are other people like Chad Daybell who are just taking a portion of Mormon theology and twisting it to fit whatever it is that they want to live and whatever they want to believe. Either way, these groups are really harmful because they start dabbling in these areas where they believe they're speaking to God. They believe that they're getting these revelations from God. And then they start telling other people what to do and how to live their lives. And then they start believing that they're powerful. And the marriage of Chad's type of theology with sort of mainstream teachings gives it a little bit of credibility, where it's really easy for people to just go astray and wander off into these crazy delusions. And already people have died, and it will not stop. More people will be harmed because of this. We've already seen more cases that have come out since Chad and Lori were arrested. These fringe groups are still out there. They still exist. And if people have information on them, I would love to talk with you, because it's one of the things that I'm really passionate about exploring and exposing these groups, just so that people have the information about what's out there and what they're teaching.
Now, the media flood that has come against me, right? The media flood that has come against me is from Lucifer, right? He does not want this job done. He does not want me to help these women. He does not want me to uplift them and strengthen them and help them hold on until he comes again to rescue us all.
Right.
He doesn't want that.
Okay.
So he wants me here.
Okay.
And he's taken everything away from me, like he took away from Job. The only thing wasn't allowed to do to Job is what?
Kill him.
He wasn't allowed to kill Job himself, right?
Yep.
But he was allowed to do everything to make Job want to kill himself, right? Everything.
Right.
So it is a personal attack on my family because Jesus asked me to do a job for him.
Okay.
So that is my belief that he has taken every single thing I've ever said and twisted it. He's taken every truth and turned it into a lie, taken every lie and turned it into a truth. So yes, that is what I feel like is happening.
Okay.
I will continue to do my job, whether I have your support or not, although I would love that. And one day, everyone will know that that is true, and that that's what happened.
I hope you can listen to what I have to say as well.
Sure.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I've done a lot of praying. I've dreamed dreams of me delivering you from demons. In those dreams, every time I yelled at you and we screamed, and then I would perform a deliverance on you, and I would call things out of you. I do not share your beliefs, and this is after a lot of pondering and praying on my own. After everything happened, I started to read the New Testament, and I wanted to trust you before I found out. I wanted to believe that Tylee and JJ were walking around somewhere, maybe in a barn. I don't know. I couldn't understand what you were doing. And I tried to just keep saying, you know what, I'm going to trust my mom. I'm going to trust my mom. I'm going to trust my mom. When I found out what happened and I started to see everything, I gave you a call. And in that call, it was very confrontational, but I felt like I wasn't judging you. And a lot of times you said I was judging you and you think that I was with everybody else and I'm like the media. And I'm glad that I called you now because I have my head on straight. And I can tell you that after a very long time of listening to what has been in the documents, these are the things they recovered from you and from Chad and these things, it doesn't make sense to me. And none of it is biblically based. And I know you have a different viewpoint, but you and I are on completely two different, I mean, it's black and white. It's that different. And
I want to revisit something that Lori said. She really believes that she's being persecuted, the media flood that's come against her, and all of the lies that she feels like lies are being told about her. And this is really part of the religious persecution complex that a lot of people in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have, because Mormons were driven out of their homes during the formation of the early church, and literally had to leave the country to go into the Utah territory to practice what were their beliefs, which was polygamy at the time. There is this sort of persecution complex that, because God spoke to our prophet and we are following the prophet, anybody who comes against us is persecuting us for our beliefs. And this is exactly what Lori believes as well. She believes that she has this special mission from Jesus Christ, and that anybody that's against her or who doesn't believe her is just persecuting her. And that at the end of the day, everybody's going to know that this was the truth, that Lori's narrative was correct, that she was given a special mission. And there's a reference to this a little bit later in the call that we'll get to in just a minute.
That she really does see Tylee as a scapegoat. That I really think this is a type of projection, that she's creating this fantasy that Tylee's responsible when in fact she knows that she's more than likely responsible. I think if in that dream Tylee had appeared and said, "I'm sorry for being such a murderer," if you take the word brat out and put murderer in, then I think it becomes completely understandable in terms of projection, because projection is essentially taking some unwanted part of ourselves and putting it out there on someone else so that we don't have to deal with it. So let's say hypothetically, I mean, we know that Lori's a convicted murderer. So let's say that Lori can't cope with that fact, that she can't digest the fact that she's a convicted murderer. It makes sense that she's going to blame someone else, instead of dealing with how difficult that is to accept as a mother, because she sees herself, or she did see herself, as this perfect mother. It's easier for her to interpret this situation by blaming Tylee. And so if she can't accept that she's a murderer, then you'd expect her to say something like, Tylee, to see Tylee coming to her and saying, "I'm sorry for being such a brat," or "I'm sorry for being such a murderer," because that's essentially what she accuses her of being.
Yeah. Accidental or not, she said it was an accidental
Accidental murder.
an accidental death done by Tylee upon her brother, which I want to point out, and we can get into a little bit, but again, Tylee was last seen in Yellowstone weeks before JJ's death and was not around. She had, according to discovery and court documents and the prosecution, Tylee had been killed weeks earlier. So it's absolutely impossible that Tylee did this. You know,
Thank you, Lauren, for saying that and for pointing out the facts of the case, which do prove that it's impossible for Tylee to have done this. I also want to reference the video that was being played while Dr. John was speaking. We've seen Lori in every possible public situation, walking in and out of the court with her head held high, swinging her hair, flirting with guards, smiling at everybody. And the reason she can do that under these circumstances is because she absolutely does believe this is part of the plan. She believes that she is an exalted being on a special mission from Jesus Christ, and that right now that plan includes her being in prison, which is fine, by the way, because she can still convert followers in there and she can still carry out her mission. So it really doesn't matter to her that she's sitting in prison right now. It doesn't matter to her that she'll probably never leave prison. Doesn't matter to her what convictions may come in the future or anything else that happens to her, because she really does believe it's part of God's plan. It's part of Jesus's plan for her.
That she's expressing, because Colby's the only one left who can love her.
Colby says that on the call, that he has not spoke. He's not spoken to his mother in 4 years. This is the first phone call. So you're right. There is a desperation in Lori. She says that losing Colby was worse than losing JJ and Tylee.
Everyone, and including you, which was really the hardest loss of all to me, because you were my best friend for 24 years. And losing you over the past 4 years was harder on me than even losing the kids.
And then goes on to say that only Colby would understand the depth of her loss of these two, but telling him that losing him has been harder on her than the death of his two siblings. And so you're right, there's this desperation for her to try to rekindle some sort of relationship, which he does not do. He says that he forgives her, but can't be in her life. And we can talk about that more when you talk with Colby.
I'm definitely looking forward to hearing Dr. John's conversation with Colby. I know that they have been in touch and that Colby's been relying on Dr. John for support, and I'm really glad to hear that. And I'm looking forward to their conversation. I just want to go back to the call for two more really important points. One is about spiritual abuse, which is any time that somebody uses doctrine or theology or scripture to try and manipulate someone's behavior or to try and convince them over into their way of thinking, saying essentially, if you and I believe the same thing, then this is what you should be doing. And why aren't you doing it? And you're going to be punished by God if you don't do it. There's some implication of that in some of Lori and Colby's later discussion.
A very long time to try to remember the person you were before all this and try to remember that you did care so much and it felt like you loved us and you tried to protect us and you were just a different person. And I understand that you believe that these are the things, and you know what? We're not even going to have an argument about that because there's no point. There's not going to be me sitting here telling you this, this, and this, but I will tell you fundamentally and 100%. After praying a lot about it and everything over the last few years, I do not agree with what you believe, and I don't think that. Yeah, but
you don't even know exactly what I do believe, honey.
So this is just prior to what I was talking about with the spiritual abuse, but I think it's important to point out Colby has given a definitive answer that he and Lori are never going to be on the same page. And I really like that he says it's pointless to argue about it. You cannot have a reasonable conversation with an unreasonable person. And Lori is obviously delusional. She obviously believes things that are not true. And there's no point in trying to convince her that she's wrong. There's no point in trying to get her to see your point of view, because she's so convicted in what she believes. And as Dr. John says, it would just simply be too painful for her to, at this point, admit the truth and come back to reality. So I really don't have any hope that it's going to happen. I always want to have hope that people can change. And if there is anything that can help Lori change, it would be this conversation with Colby. I don't know, obviously, what things have been like for her since this phone call took place. I don't know exactly the timing of the call, but I hope that her speaking with Colby helped rattle things loose just a little bit to help her realize, like, this was her last chance to try and have a relationship with her only living child. This was her last chance to reconnect with him and to see if there's anything left in salvaging that relationship. And she's just been told absolutely not. There isn't. And there's more of this boundary setting coming from Colby in just a little bit, which I really appreciate. I also think that it's really interesting that when Colby finishes his statement that he is not going to be on the same page, that he doesn't believe the same as Lori, Lori immediately fires back that you don't even know what I believe. And then term of endearment, honey, to try and soften the blow of that. She's basically saying that she's misunderstood. She's the victim here. And she's trying to convince Colby that if he would just listen to her more, if she could get more of her narrative out there, then they might be able to come to some kind of an agreement. Because right now she thinks Colby doesn't even know what Lori really believes. She thinks that Colby's been brainwashed by the media to believe that Lori preaches about zombies. And I think Lori's explained her belief and her position pretty clearly. And Colby is in a very rational state of mind right now, although he seems to be. His emotions are not dysregulated. And so I tend to believe him that he's heard everything Lori has to say and he just doesn't believe her.
He let all those things happen. He has a purpose. Right. And he told me, this is what Jesus told me 20 days before I was arrested in Hawaii. Okay. Jesus came to me, and he has several times since I've been in jail, but he came to me 20 days before I was arrested, and he said this, Lori, there is a purpose for your whole life. It is my purpose, so trust it. What do you think I thought at that time? They were talking about arresting me, and I knew I hadn't hurt anybody. I knew I never would hurt anybody. But so I didn't think I was going to get this. And he's going to make it known to the world what his purpose is in his due time. Whenever he feels like doing that, you will know. And I want you to know right now that nothing is more important to me than you. I love you. I've always loved you and cherish our relationship as eternal. I understand you being upset with me. I get it 100%. I don't blame you. But I want you to know that no matter what you've ever said about me or done or said on the video or anything negative, I forgive you. I don't hold it against you. I love you. I understand completely. And you will know one day, Colby, and you know. And that's all I can tell you. I love you more than anything. I miss being a part of your life and my grandchildren's life. I know why you're probably doing that, but we have an eternal relationship, you know. Ava came to me the night before she was born. I didn't even know that Chelsea was due with the baby. And she came to me the night before she was born. And I held her as a baby in the spirit world. And she told me that we had loved each other for eons of time. And that she loved me so much. And the joy that filled me when I held that little baby filled me. Colby, she came to me because she knew that you wouldn't let me see her and you wouldn't let me talk to her, but she said our relationship is eternal. And
So this is where the spiritual abuse and manipulation really comes into play, and Lori is laying on this very thick veneer. She's referencing that Colby has an eternal relationship with her, and she even says that Colby's daughter appeared to Lori the night before she was born so that Lori could hold her, and she guilts Colby for saying that the baby knew that Colby wouldn't let Lori see the baby, and that's why the baby came to Lori before she was born. She then says the baby tells Lori that they have an eternal relationship. This is definitely a manipulation on Lori's part, because she's referencing the eternal relationship that was founded in her belief in the original LDS church. So the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon church, believes that families are forever and that we can be sealed to our loved ones by priesthood authority to be connected, essentially. That sealing is a connection that continues on past death. Now, the LDS people are not the only people that teach that we can be with our loved ones after this life is over, but they believe that they're the only ones with the proper priesthood authority given to Joseph Smith by Peter, James, and John. And so LDS people believe that they are the only ones who will really be able to be with their loved ones because they are the only ones with the proper authority. That's a rabbit hole for another time. But that's what Lori's referencing when she's talking to Colby about their eternal relationship. Now, what's really interesting, though, is that in the LDS faith, in order to have that eternal relationship, that bond, that sealing, that connection, You have to be married in the temple. Lori never has been, not even to Chad. They were married on a beach in Hawaii. Now, obviously, I know they've been to the temple. Lori says that Moroni married them in the temple because they had already been married in a past life. And so, obviously, Lori's version of the LDS theology is going to make room for whatever situation she needs to make room for. So, I suppose it's possible that she believes that she's been sealed to her children already through some kind of super secret ceremony that already happened. Lori was never married in the temple to Colby's father. So in the eyes of the mainstream church, Lori and Colby are not sealed together because Colby was not born into a marriage that was sealed in the temple. So by the same token, my own children are not technically sealed to me through that priesthood power because I married someone who was not a member of the church. We never went to the temple to have that sealing ceremony performed because he left the church shortly after being baptized, just a few months later. So technically, according to Mormon theology, my kids and I are not going to be together when this life is over. Same with Lori and Colby and her other two children. So saying that she has an eternal relationship with Colby is a manipulation, and it's also not in line with mainstream LDS teachings, which doesn't really matter at this point because we know Lori has gone far astray from the LDS teachings. But that's where it has its root. And if Lori believes that she has the power to cast out evil spirits, she probably also believes that she has the sealing power. And she's probably performed all kinds of weird ceremonies during the time that she and Chad were attending the temple together multiple times.
And I had to accept the fact that I lost my mom too. I had to accept that. But with that being said, with you being there, I need to tell you this. You did raise me. You took care of me, you took care of my needs. You tried to protect me the best you could. And I'm grateful for what you did for me when I was a child. But I will tell you this situation does belongs. And you were not the same in my dreams. And you were not the same person. And I had to accept the fact that I lost my mom too. I had to accept that. But with that being said, with you being there, I need to tell you this. You did raise me. You took care of me, you took care of my needs. You tried to protect me the best you could. And I'm grateful for what you did for me when I was a child. But I will tell you this situation does put us at odds. And I can't sit here and say that I agree with you. I can't even really understand where this side's coming from. I don't wish pain or anything on you. I have no malice towards you. Zero. But I do want you to find comfort.
You don't have malice towards anyone.
No, and I won't. And I do 100% forgive you. I forgive you. And I'm not going to hold you in a jail cell of my heart, but you cannot be a part of my children's lives. And I think you need to understand why. Because you and I can't even be a part of each other's lives. Because I don't feel like I know you anymore. And I don't want to hurt you by telling you that, but I don't want to lead you on.
Well, how is that forgiveness? How is that
Forgiveness is a choice of forgiving. It doesn't mean you keep going. It doesn't mean that. And if you and I are this different on our beliefs of what happened to my family, then how could we ever even conversate? I can't sit here and pretend like this isn't what it is. And I hate all of it. And I hate that you are still suffering in some way. But at the same time, I understand it. You and I do not agree. And I can't say, even listening to you, I don't feel that conviction in my heart that that's what happened. But that's what you think happens. That's what you say happens. And you know what? I wasn't there. But I know what I feel. And I have my own spiritual intelligence. And I have my own ability to search and ponder. And I guess this leaves us to a place where all I can ever know is that I will find out one day in heaven. And that's all I could ever say about it. Because you and I cannot agree on these things. I do not wish harm on you. I saw you in that courtroom and I wish I could have talked to my mom. I wish I had my mom there. I wish I had my brother and my sister to look at all my kids. I wish my dad was here and being a part of it.
So I really love what Colby says here about forgiveness. Forgiveness is a choice. that you forgive somebody, but it doesn't mean that you continue. And I think this is something that manipulators frequently use against their victims, especially if there's any kind of religious affiliation or connection. When manipulators talk about forgiveness, they mean they want to go back to where the relationship was before it was damaged. They don't mean that they want to accept responsibility for what they've done and make changes and move forward in good faith. What they mean is they want to go back to the time when they were able to manipulate you. And I absolutely believe this is what Lori is asking Colby for. When he says you can't be a part of my life, she says, how is that forgiveness then? It's because Lori wants things to go back to the way they were when she could still manipulate Colby. She still wants to have a relationship with him so that she can get narcissistic supply from him, basically. So she can feel like she is still controlling him in some way. I think forgiveness is one of the most largely misunderstood concepts ever. It is really a religious concept. And to try to take forgiveness out of religion and understand it outside of a religious context, I don't think is a really helpful exercise, because every religion sort of has its take on what forgiveness looks like and what forgiveness means. But if we look at the biblical idea of forgiveness, when I was a gospel doctrine teacher in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I remember going through the Doctrine and Covenants, and there's a specific scripture in there that talks about forgiveness, and it's the main thing that Mormons believe. This is where Lori's root belief of forgiveness would have been formed. This is a quote from Boyd K. Packer, who used to be one of the main leaders of the church. He's quoting from Doctrine and Covenants, section 58, verse 42, which was written by Joseph Smith. And Joseph Smith taught that this was a revelation from God. Boyd K. Packer says, no matter what our transgressions have been, no matter how much our actions may have hurt others, that guilt can all be wiped out. To me, perhaps the most beautiful phrase in all scripture is when the Lord says, behold, he who has repented of his sins, the same is forgiven, and I, the Lord, remember them no more. That is the promise of the gospel of Jesus Christ and the atonement. So this is absolutely what Lori believes about forgiveness, or at least what her root belief of forgiveness would have been. But according to the New Testament, it's slightly different. In Matthew chapter 6, it says, if you don't forgive other people, then God's not going to forgive you either. And the LDS scriptures go on to say that if you don't forgive other people, then the greater sin lies with you. So this is also what Lori would believe, that if Colby doesn't forgive her, that Colby has the greater sin. Once again, Mormon theology doesn't just stop at the Bible, it takes the Bible and adds to it. The Mormon scripture just takes it one step beyond God won't forgive you. Not only will he not forgive you, but it's a greater sin to not forgive your brother. So going back to the Mormon concept of forgiveness, meaning that God does not remember your sins anymore, I think Lori wants Colby to apply that same logic to this situation. Lori wants forgiveness to mean that Colby forgives her and also forgets, right? That's the phrase, forgive and forget. But we have to take forgiveness out of the religious context in order to really have a healthy perspective on it. Because if I forgive someone and then I forget what they did, it opens me up to be harmed by them again in the same exact way. Those of us who have experienced abuse at the hands of other people or manipulation at the hands of other people have to look at forgiveness in a completely different way. How do you forgive your abuser and then remain in the same situation with them and allow yourself to be abused again? The psychology around this can become complicated, and I don't want to dilute the issue with a lot of different examples of why people stay in abusive relationships, etc. What I want to point out, though, is that when you have endured abuse at the hands of someone else, the healthiest thing to do is to let go of your negative feelings about that person. And I believe that's what Colby is saying here. But then you don't forget what happened. You have to use what happened to inform your future interactions with that person. You're under no obligation to remain in a position to be harmed by someone. Forgiveness does not mean that you stay and allow them to continue to hurt you or to continue to manipulate you. The healthiest form of forgiveness is for us, as Colby says, to make a personal decision to release the negative feelings that we have about another person. But it doesn't mean you stay. Shaming someone for the way that they choose to practice forgiveness is just another way of manipulating and abusing them. It's a form of spiritual abuse, and it's a lot more common than I think people want to admit. There are plenty of instances where it's perfectly appropriate to have healthy boundaries around interactions with family members. This is a perfect example, but it's definitely not the only example. You don't have to have a murderer in your life to give yourself permission to create healthy boundaries around your family members. If you have a family member who manipulates you or who abuses you or tries to coerce you or control you, you have every right to create a boundary where you don't interact with that person anymore. Just because they are your blood relative doesn't mean that you have to allow them into your life and give them information that they are then going to use against you to harm you. Those of us who have unhealthy, manipulative, coercive family members have to create boundaries in order to keep ourselves safe. Even if those family members are now trying to do better and change, that doesn't mean we should immediately rush back into a relationship. We have to take the space and the time that we need to heal before we can even consider interacting with those family members again. If you have a family member who has distanced themselves for whatever reason, and you go and try to convince them to come back and have a relationship with the person that they've created a firm boundary around, you are part of the problem. We should not be forcing anyone to interact with any other human being that they don't want to interact with. I can't tell you how many times I heard the phrase, but he or she is your insert family relationship here, and then tell me that I should forgive that person and that we should have a relationship again. The concept of families are forever in the Mormon church is one of those classic ways that people exercise spiritual abuse without even really realizing it. They will tell you you're sealed to that person, you're a forever family, you have an eternal relationship, you need to forgive them now so that you can be together in the afterlife. And it's just very harmful rhetoric for those people who have endured abuse. I hope if you get nothing else out of this conversation, that you will take this scenario and look at the relationships in your life. Maybe there are people that you need to create boundaries around, and you've been preventing yourself from doing that because you feel guilty about harming the familial relationship. If your family members really do love and care about you and want the best for you, then they're going to be fine with you setting a boundary that is going to ultimately lead to you having better mental health. If you witness someone in your family creating boundaries or distancing themselves, please give them the space to do that. And if you need to distance yourself, I would love to have a conversation with you about how to do that in a healthy way. Also, you should consult a mental health professional because it's a really difficult thing to do. It can be a very lonely process, and you can get a lot of pushback from family members who don't want any distance from you. When we leave unhealthy systems, we become a mirror for the people who stay. And the people who stay start to question their own relationships and their own participation in the system. Sometimes that can bring up feelings of shame for these people, and they want to pull you back in so that they will feel less ashamed. I was working with a client last week, and I gave this example of a group of girlfriends going out to lunch. And let's say that you guys always go out to lunch and you always have this special dessert together. And let's say one of the girls in the group has decided to eat more healthy, and so she's not going to have the dessert this time. There's going to be a different reaction from everyone at the table. Some people will say nothing But internally, they'll have a narrative of, oh, she's eating more healthy. I should probably do that too. And that brings up feelings of shame for that person. But the people who are unhealthy, who can't relate in healthy ways to other people, will feel the need to publicly call out the person who is eating healthy and try to convince them not to. They might say something like, oh, come on, this is our once a week lunch. It's a tradition. We always do this together. If you don't have the dessert, you're not one of us. Some kind of language like that might take place. If someone is really manipulative, they might even order the dessert for you behind your back and then get the waiter to bring it to you and see what your reaction is going to be. They want to know how committed you are to eating healthy. If you're really committed, you'll just say, sorry, this was a mistake and you should take it back. But the manipulative person doesn't really care whether you eat the dessert or not. They just want to see what your reaction is. They want to know if you can be controlled. If they ordered the dessert for you, the waiter brings it, and you cave and decide to eat it anyway, the manipulator makes a mental note of that, and they make a concerted effort to use that information to manipulate you in the future. This is why manipulative people can be so harmful and so hard to detect and hard to confront, because can you really prove that that person ordered the dessert for you and that it wasn't just a mistake that was made by the waiter? Do you really want to call them out and have that discussion in public in front of all of your girlfriends? It can be really difficult to confront manipulators, but allowing them to continue a pattern of abuse without ever confronting them leads to situations where they eventually are going to harm somebody, either psychologically or physically. I think that the way Colby has reacted in this situation is the best possible way that we can start to set boundaries with people like this in our lives. He unequivocally told Lori that he does not believe her narrative. He unequivocally told her that she cannot be a part of his life. He told her she cannot be a part of his children's lives, and he told her exactly why. And that's all he needs to do. In fact, he didn't even really need to tell her that in order to create the boundary. He could have just done it. He could have just said to himself, well, I'm not ever going to interact with my mother again. But I think there's something very powerful in setting those boundaries in a verbal way. You know, the other person has heard you. They have absolutely no excuse to contact you or to try and get you to have a relationship with them if you very firmly verbally told them. I am also an advocate in some situations of quiet quitting where you just stop talking to the person. You don't owe anybody an explanation. If it feels better for you to offer the explanation, then I think it's a good thing to do. But just be prepared for the pushback that you're going to get, as Lori pushed back on Colby, tried to shame him for not forgiving her in the way she wanted to be forgiven. And there's one last little dig that she gets in on Colby.
And I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that you have a support system with Kelsey and her family. I'm grateful that you have that. I'm grateful that the kids have that. And this is my mission, and my mission will be revealed to everybody at some point, and including you. And at that time, I just want you to know, I'm not going to say I told you so. I'm just going to say I love you.
I'm not going to say I told you so. I'm just going to say I love you. Lori absolutely believes that one day in heaven that Jesus Christ is going to stand up and defend her and tell everyone that she had this special mission and absolve her of any wrongdoing she may have completed. And Lori believes that when that happens, that Colby's going to be there. He's going to know that what Lori said is true. And when that happens, Lori's not going to gloat or shame him or say, I told you so. She's just going to say, I love you. The level of arrogance that it takes to say something like that is mind-blowing to me. But Lori comes by it honestly, because in reality, the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints believe this exact same thing. They believe that they have it right about the way life is supposed to be lived. They believe that the way that they're doing it is correct and that everyone else is wrong. And they believe that someday in heaven that everybody's going to know that the Mormons got it right. That's why there's that joke in South Park. It's a rabbit hole you can go follow if you want to. But all of these religious leaders come to the pearly gates and St. Peter's sitting there with the book. And the guy says, wait, I was a faithful Catholic priest and I served God my whole life. How come I don't get in? And he said, well, you're Catholic. And he says, well, and I'm paraphrasing here. I watched this like 10 years ago. He says, well, was it the Lutherans? Was it the Jews? Was it the Buddhists? Who was it? And St. Peter goes in his book and he looks up and he says, oh, it was the Mormons. Yes, the Mormons had it right. So the people in the LDS church really do believe that when you get to heaven, if you're not a member, that you're going to find out that what they said was true the whole time and that you were wrong. And I guess you don't get into the highest level of heaven. Again, the arrogance is really mind-blowing to me. I did believe this at one time. At the time, I convinced myself that these little loopholes of doing baptisms for dead people and, just would allow more people to get into heaven. But there was a big part of me too that just believed that God would work everything out. And I wanted to believe in a loving God who really did care about everyone and wouldn't keep people out of heaven if they were good people just because they didn't follow the correct religion. But that's not what my religion taught. And I'm very grateful that I am free from that harmful mindset that we all know better than you do. The only reason I bring that up is because that is absolutely what Lori would have been taught as a child. That is absolutely what she believed up until the time that she met Chad Daybell. And I think that the Daybell theology is sort of this mesh between mainstream Mormonism and what Chad Daybell invented to get what he wanted. I think that when Lori and Chad met, Lori already obviously had this belief that she was an exalted being because she believed that Jesus came to her in 2017. I do another video on my channel, which I will link below, that explains what I think happened when Chad and Lori met. I think that they met, I think that they were in contact long before they actually met in person. And I believe that they were sharing their like-minded beliefs for a long time before that October meeting in 2018. I also describe a little bit of how LDS theology merges with what Chad taught and how Lori and Chad could have played off of each other's beliefs in order to create the scenarios that ended in people's deaths. Most of all, I just want to give my love and respect to Colby for doing this interview and for making it available for other people to hear and to understand where Lori is right now. And I guess the big question is, does she still believe it? I think we've answered that question. I think she does still believe it. Do I think she'll ever change? I touched on that just a little bit. I think that if there is an opportunity for her to change, it's going to be in the wake of this phone call, in the wake of her really losing Colby finally. They haven't been in touch in a long time, and I think Lori believed that she lost him, but at some point they would still be in touch. And I think she was probably thrilled to get the request to have a phone call with him. Now that he has officially closed the door on there being any kind of relationship between him and her and between her and his children, I'm hopeful that it will cause Lori to have some introspection and some reflection. However, given the depth of her delusion and the painful journey that she would have to go through in order to accept reality, I really don't think she's strong enough to do it. I think that's why she was even willing to admit that Lucifer was trying to get her to take her own life. I think it will be interesting to see if she does mount any kind of a defense in Arizona And that's one of the reasons I want to be there for that trial. I want to know how my other family members were involved. And although I don't really believe in closure, I believe that when the Arizona trial is over, it will be like the ending of a story that's unresolved, but at least I'll be finished with the book. If you're new to the channel, I invite you to join us on Sunday and Wednesday evenings for a live Q&A. We have a wonderfully supportive community of fellow healers who are all working towards the journey of creating revolutionary healing in our lives. And I hope to interact with you soon there. Until then, be good to each other, but mostly be good to yourself. Hello, beautiful humans. Thank you for joining me tonight. This has been a really long journey for me. I have been thinking about it since October 6th, and I have been really contemplating what I wanted to say. And then I spent a lot of time, actually spent about 3 hours yesterday recording an episode. And I just set it aside, left it, and said, I'm just going to have a great evening. And I got up early this morning to edit it so that I could get it out and posted. And when I got to the very first audio clip that I was sharing of the phone call, I realized that I had forgotten to click a button that would have prevented a ridiculously huge echo. And so there was this awful echo on every single one of the video clips that I shared. And I couldn't think of a way to edit it that would be more efficient than just re-recording it. So I just had to re-record the whole thing. And then I had to edit that and then get it posted. So I finished editing it probably 15 or 20 minutes before I posted it tonight. So it's been a long journey. It's been a lot to unpack. I am so sick of the sound of my own voice right now that I just want to never do another episode again. But I'm glad that I slogged through and did it because I think it was a conversation that needed to be had. It was a conversation I needed to have. It helped me to process through all of the feelings that I had when the video first came up. And to be honest, I don't know. I mean, I saw the notification come up from Colby's channel while I was celebrating my birthday. And I didn't know if I really wanted to watch it. But at the same time, I couldn't not watch it. I care so much about Colby and his journey that to see him put something up so raw and vulnerable, I just didn't want to miss it. So I made it part of my birthday celebration, which was pretty cool. My celebration was cool, not that I had to make this a part of it. But because I was celebrating, I don't think that I really sat down and focused on it emotionally. So the first listen through, I sort of let it fly over my head a little bit. And it wasn't until I came back to it the second time and then the third time before I really started to let it sink in. And so I really meant what I said at the beginning of the video, that I wanted it to be Colby's story to share, and I didn't want to intervene with the same kind of commentary that so many other channels are going to have. So I hope that what I had to add was beneficial, even though there are probably 20 or 30 different channels that commented on this particular call. I had a great birthday. Thank you. And I just tend to make my birthdays exactly what I want them to be. And I had a wonderful time. I shared a little bit on Crush's channel. I did show up on Crush's channel when she was unpacking some of this the other night because I I didn't intend to really make commentary on it, but she invited me to come on when she was in the middle of going through this video, and I had a few thoughts pop into my head. So going on her channel actually really helped me to solidify the angle that I wanted to take when I was doing this for my own channel. So I appreciate Kresha letting me come on and talk about my feelings, because it really did help me get prepared for this and what I wanted to say. But I shared a little bit on Kresha's channel about my birthday celebration. I was sitting right here at my table, and I was putting together my Lego Millennium Falcon that my son gave me for Mother's Day. I was watching a James Bond movie and drinking pink champagne on General Conference morning when, as a true believing Mormon, I would have been sitting listening to conference. So it felt like a really excellent celebration to me, apart from the fact that I had to listen to, or I chose to listen to, this interview that was hard to listen to. I think the difficult thing for me every time is that I get hit with the realization of the reality of Tylee and JJ's deaths every time. I have yet to think about this case when that doesn't hit me. I think when I first started talking about it, I was really focused on Lori and what she did. And as I got more engaged with it, I started focusing on the kids and what the experience was like for them. And ever since then, I haven't been able to stop thinking of that perspective of it, which I think is a good thing, because I think that's what we should all be focused on. I really meant what I said too at the end of the episode when I said that I don't believe in closure, but I'm really happy that when Lori's trial in Arizona is over, that I will be able to say that I finished the book. I don't know if you've ever had that experience when you've been reading a story that is really hard to read and there's really no resolution to it or a satisfactory end to it, but the story is over at least, and you're left to kind of imagine if things worked out or how they did. And for me personally, that means that I will finish the book, and then for me, my story will go on in a different direction. It's always going to be part of my history and part of my life and who I am, but it's not going to be where I live. I hope that's true for everybody. I hope that's true for everyone who follows this case, that we will take the things that we learned into our lives going forward, but that we don't live with this constant pain over what happened. I'm never going to forget. I don't believe in forgive and forget, obviously. And also, I was talking about this concept of forgiveness with someone at one point, and I forget exactly who it was or what format, but they were sharing with me an episode that Dr. Romani did, I think, when she went on Jay Shetty's podcast, which I just read an article where apparently Jay Shetty hasn't been super honest about his origins, but that's a rabbit hole for another time. But Dr. Romani, somebody asked her, I think that was the scenario. Somebody asked her, how do you forgive a narcissist? And she says, I don't forgive him. I don't have any ill will towards Lori. Like, I don't have any feelings of hate. But I also don't forgive her. I don't think what she did is forgivable. When I was a Mormon, I would have said that, like, it's up to God to punish her. It's not up to me. So forgiveness isn't mine to give. But I think now forgiveness from me is not a gift that she deserves. And TC, I'm going to post this because I like this better than anything else. I can forgive myself because I know me, I know my heart, I know my intentions. I know that the mistakes that I've made were not intended to harm people, so I can forgive myself for my mistakes. I can forgive myself. I don't think I can forgive Lori. I don't think she deserves it. Yeah. And Destiny, it's tricky not knowing what part she played. We don't know exactly, but for me personally, I suspect that her level of involvement was relatively high. And I'm okay with not knowing exactly how much she was involved. I believe that she was the orchestrator. So I want to continue this conversation on forgiveness. I want to bring in some people who are smarter than me. Because it's a contemplation that I've had for a long time. I think ever since Chad's sentence came down. And maybe since Lori's did too, I've kind of been contemplating, like, how do we forgive? How do we move on? How do we heal? And contemplating, what forgiveness is. I just came to the conclusion that it's a religious concept, and I don't think that it has any place in a world where there are so many people who've been harmed. Like, I struggle with it so much because the religious me, the Mormon me, would have said, like, I'm going to forgive this person. And then if they abuse me again, then God is going to take care of me. And he's going to make up all of my losses to me in the next life. And now I'm like, I sure as heck am not going to allow myself to be abused again. No, I'm not going to forgive somebody and keep myself in proximity to them. There is a okay, well, we, love the sinner, hate the sin, right? Not me. If somebody hurts me or treats me badly, sorry, that's it. You're done. You don't get a place in my life. I can consider it again, if there's a lot of evidence that you're trying to repair and you're trying to make things right, you're trying to do better. But when somebody treats me with disrespect, that's it. You get banished to behind the rope. If you want to get back into the rope, you have to do some significant work to get there. So I love you, beautiful humans. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being a support and a strength to me in a place where I don't have a lot of people who are standing by my side during this journey. So thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for supporting each other. Thank you for being kind and respectful to each other in the chat. And I have a kiddo who has asked for a thing, so I have to go do a mom thing. So I'm gonna sign off, but I will see you right back here on Wednesday evening around 7:30ish Central Time. The kicker is that right before this video dropped, this call with Colby dropped, I was working on an episode on indoctrination and brainwashing and religious brainwashing and stuff like that. So I was going through all of my brainwashing experiences and recording an episode about that and editing that. And I came straight off of that to this. So I am super exhausted. I'm going to take a couple of days. Well, today's Monday, so I'm going to take tomorrow and I'm going to take Wednesday, and then Wednesday evening I will post that episode that's already been edited. And yes, we will do a live Q&A afterwards. So thank you again for being here. I can't wait to see you again on Wednesday. And I hope that you guys have an excellent evening. And I hope that you take something away from this that helped you. And if you found something helpful in this video, if you would put it in the comments, I would really appreciate it, because I want other people to know something that you've learned from this. And I love to see it myself, because I like to know that the work that I'm doing is helping other people. It's what brings me a lot of joy. So I hope you take care of each other. This is a lot of people here in the chat, so please hit the like button on your way out. And please share this episode with someone who you know needs to hear it. Subscribing is the best free way to support the channel. If you have the means to become a member, of course, I would love that. And I'm excited about having more conversations with you guys on the subject of healing and moving on after tragedy. So I hope that you take care, and I will talk with you again on Wednesday.